Great. Well, welcome everyone to the Crafting for Spaces Everyone webinar, where we'd like to have a great discussion with Vicki and Nicholas and share with you all sort of how we've been thinking about how to craft inclusive storytelling through visualizations. Before we begin, I'd like to just share with you where we are calling in from. So we are joining you from our Toronto studio, which is hosted on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. This land is home to now many, including diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We're grateful for this land and its boundaries. As a firm, a BDP Quadrangle and Human Space, we collectively push our sustainable practices, resiliency, and inclusive design practices to embrace our responsibility now and in planning for our future 7 generations. We continue in our spirit of respect and reconciliation. So for those of you who are on the call, we encourage you to check out native-land.ca. It's a registered Canadian non-for-profit organization. You can click on the map, see where you are, and understand the range of First Nation territories and areas that you may reside in. This tool is meant to foster conversations about the history of colonialism, Indigenous ways of knowing, and settler-Indigenous relationships, and we encourage you to check it out. For anyone who's on the call, feel free to, we'd love to understand in the chat where you might be calling from. So before we begin today, just a little bit about our agenda. We'll do a round of introductions. We'll spend a good chunk of our time having a panel discussion with our 2 key guests, and we'll reserve the last 15 minutes for any questions and answers. So there is a Q&A session. So feel free to pop your questions in there and we'll take a look at it towards the end. I'm loving seeing where everyone's from. We've got Vancouver, Victoria, New York, Ottawa, welcome. Mississauga, Burlington, St. John's. That's great. Welcome, everyone. So I guess with introductions, I'll start. My name's Lorraine Cazier and my pronouns are she, her. I am the Accessibility and Wellness Lead of Human Space, which is the inclusive design practice of BDP Quadrangle. With us, we also have Nicholas Dabadine and Vicki Casey. Nick is the BIM and Design Technology Manager and an associate at BDP here in Toronto. Throughout his career, he has developed BIM management tools, protocols, procedures for some of North America's largest architecture firms. He sees our day-to-day project work in BIM and guides BIM development and strategies. Nick is also an active member of the Ontario Revit community and teaches part-time at George Brown College, lecturing 3rd and 4th year architecture students on the fundamentals of Revit architecture and BIM management. Welcome, Nicholas. Vicki is an architect director and leads in architect director and leads BDP's Leeds studio. Vicki, that's a mouthful, tongue twister there.
It is in the UK.
As an integral part of the healthcare sector team, she has contributed to multiple award-winning projects and serves as a strategic advisor with clear understanding of the interplay between clinical process and the development of logical master plan. Her vision always includes a requirement for flexibility and patient-focused approach, ensuring that the building meets all the needs of all users and its exceptional quality. So welcome, Vicki.
Thank you. Hi.
Before we move on, Nicholas, was there anything you wanted to share or say?
No, just say thanks for the intro and welcome to everybody online.
Great. So what I am super excited about and thrilled about is, although Human Space's day-to-day practice focuses solely on inclusion and what it means to realize inclusive and equitable built environments, with me on the phone today are 2 of my colleagues who have naturally done it in their day-to-day practice as well, even though they may not necessarily have that as their sole focus. So we're here to talk about the BDP inclusive storytelling in the BDP People Library. So maybe our first question for everyone for everyone here and Vicky is, what is the idea behind crafting spaces for everyone?
Yeah, shall I speak to that? So we're here to talk about the BDP Inclusive People Library, which is born out of the idea that when we are visualizing architecture or landscape or design projects, and actually anywhere in the media beyond that, it's within our gift to populate those images with whatever story we choose to tell with the people and how we place those people in our visuals. And it's perhaps something that it's plausible that people don't particularly think about necessarily as much as they could, but we are in the industry of creating imaginary places that don't yet exist. That's, when we are developing architecture or urban spaces and designs, we're looking at the future. And so really it's within our gift to choose to tell whatever story we like with how we place the people into those images. So it's really it's really interesting to think of it maybe in terms of if you were producing a film and you had a script and you had the characters that are within your visuals, they have a backstory and they have a story to tell, and so we can be much more thoughtful in the way that we populate those visuals, and that can bring a lot of power to the inclusivity of this future spaces that we are then depicting, which I'm sure we are all trying to depict places that are an improvement on the world as we see it. But as we go through the webinar, I think it might become apparent that sometimes actually we may be depicting worse realities than the status quo, which is really what this session is aimed at, making people just have a think about.
That's great, Vicky. I love how you talk about it as a gift, as something that we're in control in. So maybe, tell us a little bit about sort of how this idea started and sort of the first sort of, when did you realize this was something that you maybe needed to take control over?
Could you go on to the next slide with that, I think? Yeah, so it all started with a healthcare project where we were working with a client in the UK, a hospital trust, and they had a guidance document for how they wanted their hospital trust to be branded and shown to. So it was a branding document guidelines that said that no patient should ever be depicted on their own in a space. So you'll see this is a kind of picture of a hospital bedroom, which was a first draft. It was just a very early render. It wasn't aimed at the external as an external visual, but you can see that there's a patient depicted in the bed. It was a pediatric children's hospital, and we realized that this didn't meet their guidelines and that was to do with them portraying themselves as a caring trust. Part of their major responsibility is to care for their patients. So if in any imagery, be it a branding document, be it a leaflet, be it a poster, a patient is depicted on their own, then that goes against one of their core principles, which is that they are providing care to their people. And that got me thinking about how actually maybe BDP is a really large global architecture and multidisciplinary design firm. And wouldn't it be great if we had a guidance document which allowed people to be more thoughtful about how they populate our images? Because as I said, it's within our gift to depict that. So this image here as a draft is kind of showing it tells you an awful lot that's not particularly good, with only white figure characters. So the person who is stood beside the door has a short haircut and a masculine stereotypical coat and a flat-soled heeled shoe, and you might interpret that figure to be male. in terms of the characteristics that you're given. And the character in the foreground is a bit more curved. They potentially have longer hair. They are playing with a child or entertaining a small person on their lap. And they maybe throw up ideas of a female figure. So you have potentially a male doctor, you have potentially a mother looking after the child, then you have the patient on their own, the other child on their own in the bed with nobody looking after them, and then you have somebody sitting at the side. Now, if you're in the mindset of thinking that this is a stereotypical heterosexual couple family unit, then you've maybe got a dad who's just on the phone, not paying attention to anything. And the whole thing, without thinking about it, is actually telling a really stereotypical story, which isn't challenging any preconceived ideas about how we could be telling this story in a different way. So if you go on to the next slide. So then we populated it with so this was the start of our inclusive people library, where we tried to depict more figures. So the child now in the bed, who's the patient, now has somebody sitting with them. The figure that is potentially holding the role of the doctor is possibly female, they're not white, and the figure in the foreground has an indicative facial hair, is potentially a father figure, is looking after a child, and is reading to that child and showing them attention. And it can be interpreted in many different ways, but it's at least maybe you don't even think about who it is. You just look at it as an image, but it's kind of breaking down and being a bit more thoughtful about how it's been populated and who's being given power and dominance and presence in the picture. And as I say, it came from that original piece of advice from the client that said, please don't show a patient on their own, because we want them to be seen as being cared for in their environment. So next slide.
That's really great, Vicky. I mean, I think you've captured so much in how we can tell inclusive stories. I'm hoping you can maybe break that down for us and for the audience here of, in those two images, they've switched and you've captured a lot. But yeah, maybe break it down for us of how we can tell inclusive stories.
Sure. So that was the kind of dawning moment of, can we create something which maybe breaks this down so that we can, in bite-sized chunks, give this to all of our people working in the design sector within our firm, a set of really simple things to think about when they are populating their visuals, to think about it more as you are telling a story and there are characters in that story. And with every architectural or design visualization that you're creating, that's up to you what story you're choosing to tell. So we managed to break that down into 5 kind of key steps, which are to do your research, to represent all and be conscious of avoiding tokenism, to challenge stereotypes, to realize that there's power in placement. So just because you're showing a full range of diverse different people doesn't necessarily mean that those people have the power in your image. So to be mindful of that, and then to check and challenge as a review over after you've gone through that process, to go back over and reflect on the whole composition. So we can go through those one by one now.
Thanks.
So the first one is to do your research, which is to look at demographics. And I guess this starts with a kind of citywide, townwide demographic thought process, where there will be BDP is a global company. So what is the demographic mix of one place that we might be designing for will be completely different to another. And that will be the case within any one country. And then within, as you get down to a region within that country, it will shift across north, south, east, west. And then as you get within the postcode of the local area where your site is. So to have a think about trying to find a useful source of information on local demographics, which tells you what is actually the makeup of the place where I am designing, where my site is, and actually what is the micro demographics of that site as well. So is there a certain particular user group that might shift away? So find out what the demographic mix is in the first place as a generality, and then think about the specifics of your client and that type of project, and does that warrant something that is slightly different to what that local demographic is. And
that's great, Vicky. I remember when you first shared this with the Toronto studio, I'm like, oh, we don't have anything that has the same sort of resource, and then quickly realized that we actually do. So, you know, within the US, you know, we identified that the Census Bureau profile, this one here on the left-hand side, left-hand side is showing the profile in California, and you have a breakdown of race and ethnicity and the counts and the amount, which, you know, is one way to start thinking about who your buildings will be serving. And then, of course, Statistics Canada. I don't know why I didn't think of that myself. So a lot of information. So that's the image here on the right-hand side, and a breakdown of age, education, ethnocultural and religious diversity, immigration, place of birth and citizenship. So after having that sort of insight from you, I think we looked at this and decided like this would be a good starting place to understand who we might be designing for. So I'm sure there are others, but yeah, this was one place that we identified.
Yeah, and when we've talked about this in the UK, there's a site in the UK that's particularly good at postcode finder one, which has all of our data on it, and then yeah, gradually country by country as we look in different places, you can usually find something if you search.
If you think to do it.
Yeah, if you think to do it, exactly.
Thanks, okay. Vicky. Thanks, Vicky.
And then the second guideline is to represent all and avoid tokenism. So it's similar to the one about stereotypes that's coming up, but just realizing that just because you've depicted somebody of a different demographic or a different typology, have you actually been quite tokenistic in the way that you have depicted them? Because you can be inclusive and diverse in your representation, but you could also be playing into kind of tokenistic typologies. So here we have an older couple that they are showing a kind of friendship, and there is a walking stick, but the person is not hunched over, and they're quite kind of young and trendy looking as a set of older people. So being mindful that you're not just depicting a certain type of person in a certain way because it's the easiest thing to do, because the internet throws back when you're thinking about getting people who are photorealistic, sometimes that's particularly important to check and challenge. And actually, I haven't said yet, but this is the people that we are looking at here. The end product that we created was a set of vector graphics, which we'll come on to, but this is the beginning of seeing those people as a set of Illustrator made people that have a certain graphic look about them. So not photorealistic, but we'll come on to that next. Thank you. So then the next one is to challenge stereotypes, which is, as we were beginning to touch on. So the image on the left is a more stereotypical older person who's slightly hunched over with a walking stick. And then we have the next image where we have challenged that stereotype, and we're showing a friendship between people of different ethnicities, both of them older, doing a kind of casual jog type activity. So showing older people with an interest in still maintaining their kind of physical mobility. The wrinkle in this is that it's important. Sometimes it's really important to show people in a more stereotypical way, because it might be really important that you are catering for somebody who does have more mobility issues. So you might choose to depict an older person who has more frailty, or you might choose to depict older people who are more active, but just to be mindful in that choice that it is a decision that you have made knowingly rather than something that you have just lazily picked up. You're like, I want to show an older person. This is the easiest older person graphic that I've got. I've thrown them into my visual. Like, why have you put them in? And what is the thought process behind the story of them being in your visual? We've then got the stereotype of a mother looking after the baby in the pram. And then we have a couple, both of them appear to be masculine, and they're looking after more than one child, two small children in a buggy, which is something where, you know, this is not pushing the boundaries of the relationships that exist out in the real world. But how many times have you seen in an architectural visual a couple of dads looking after more than one child in our graphics? It's like, we shouldn't be less diverse than the real world that's out there. And sometimes it's really important to show mothers with babies if you're wanting to maybe depict a maternity hospital or an environment where that is the main user group who is going to be using the building. But if it's just a visual of a parkscape or something, then why would all the parents, all the people doing the caring responsibility of looking after the small children, are they all just depicted as female because that's the graphic that is available? So just being mindful about those stereotypes. And the next one. So then we get on to power in placement, and the image on the left shows a kind of park populated. There's a good mix of different ethnicities, different people with different skin colors. There's a good mix of ages. There's a small pair of children playing. There's, in the background, there's an older couple going for a jog. There's there's quite a good diverse mix, but right in the foreground, there are three slim, young, able-bodied people. So they have the power in that image. They've been placed most prominently, and everybody else is just falling into the background. So this is kind of also touching on that kind of tokenism thing, where it's diverse, but it's not particularly inclusive. And then the image on the right is showing that flip between, actually, each time you want to represent somebody who's maybe giving a presentation in, say, a lecture theatre or something that you're designing, who is the person that has the power in terms of being seen as the person who is giving the lecture, and then who is the person who is more passive and is listening to the lecture, and have you been mindful in terms of which type of which person have you picked to have that role? And again, trying to find different people to tell different stories. Next slide.
I remember you presenting the power and placement the first time, Vicky, and it really did take me a moment or two to pick up on the nuances, but because it's so pervasive in a lot of imagery. So,
and it's so easy to do, because quite often it's not that people are deliberate in what they're doing. You just quite often do reflect yourself unknowingly. It's quite a natural thing, and it's quite a hard thing to talk about, but I think we need to talk about it, because actually it can be slightly uncomfortable, but it can, you know, everybody has biases, and the first step is to be aware that you are actually using those biases. So then the fifth thing is to check and challenge, which is, I think, when we go back to thinking about that park image that we just looked at, it was diversely populated, but when you look at the whole collective story, which is being told across the visual, the check and challenge is to go back through and ask yourself, does this embrace a range of different ethnicities, cultures, and perspectives? Well, yes, it did. Does the visualization feel genuine and trustworthy? Well, maybe it did. Are the visualizations and the graphics biased towards my own experience and background? Well, that's where that one would have started to fail, maybe, because the foreground was so prominently just of one type. Will this exclude or offend somebody? Does this image promote existing stereotypes, or does it challenge them? And am I encouraging a better, more inclusive vision of the future? So this was our, trying to give everybody a kind of really quick set of things that are easy to digest, that might just make people think in a more thoughtful way about where they're putting the people in their images and why. So then if we go into this example, it's maybe playing into some stereotypes where you've got an older person in the foreground and they are in a mobility scooter, you've got a mother pushing the pram, and then you've got nobody with a real obvious physical disability other than the gentleman in the foreground who is on show. And then if we go on to the slight flip, so just by making a really small number of adjustments, you've now got the active older couple, you've got a lady in the wheelchair talking to somebody who has a different ethnicity to her in the background, and you have a male figure pushing the pram. Now, all of these, it might be more appropriate for the other version. You know, if something that you're doing is to do with designing that crossing and making it safe for people on a mobility scooter, then it might be entirely appropriate to have the other depiction. But it's just, again, about being mindful about why have you made certain choices and have you thought about it.
That's
Next
great,
slide.
Vicky. So I think you've talked a little bit about the People Library and how it started, but maybe could you break that down a bit more for everyone on the call?
Yeah, so we wanted to create a resource for BDP to use and human space to use, where we just made it easier for people to pick up and utilize people in their images. That was a database for us. And so we considered all of these different protected characteristics when we were creating, I guess, less stereotypical characters. So with those being, people who were pregnant and in a maternal role. I don't know if you probably don't want to Google photorealistic images of pregnant women, but if you do, then you quite quickly get into some quite scary depictions of women in stilettos and different, things that just, you're like, that is not what I am looking for. It can be quite challenging. And then, gender reassignment, sexual orientation, sex, marriage, civil and partnerships, the race, disability, age, and religious beliefs. So trying to depict a much wider, broader set of people in our graphics. And then we took some time to create a base set of people. And I think external visualizers sometimes have databases of like 3,000 photorealistic people that they pick from when they populate images. And actually, we've only created about 150 to 200 characters in our inclusive people library. And a lot of them, as you'll see as we go forward, are just like little subtle things that you don't see in any of those 3,000 people. But it's just, and actually within those 200 people that we have, we maybe have like a top 20 that we use all the time who are just particularly like good at portraying the different, more diverse stories. So it's not a massive I think when we started this exercise, we thought this is going to be an overwhelming task to try and create this resource, but actually the power is in the thoughtfulness of the people populating the visuals. The power isn't necessarily in the resource itself. It's the change in mindset.
I love that, Vicky.
So they're a set of vector people. They are in Illustrator that's the starting point of the people library, and we have a whole different range of people within that. These 5 characters kind of show a obvious physical disability, and we have a child who has, you can tell in their posture that they are more realistic as having some kind of physical disability. I think we've been talking to different companies, and I think one of them said, oh, you can we have a wheelchair in our photorealistic library, and you can put anybody in it. We can use the 3D animated figures, and you can change them into a seated position, and you can put anybody, and you can change the color of their skin. And we're like, that just looks like an able-bodied person sitting in a seat who just happens to be in a wheelchair, and that's kind of missing some of the point. And then we have a mother who's in a wheelchair holding her baby. We have the elderly gentleman again on the mobility scooter. Somebody who's just a child just having a chat with another person in a wheelchair, and then somebody who's potentially got a stick for visual impairment on the other side. And I think I would quite like us to create some more modern wheelchairs, because the wheelchairs in themselves look a little bit maybe not that funky in terms of how they
yeah, they certainly look like the hospital rentals,
yeah,
as opposed to those specialized customized ones. But yeah, it's a great start, that's for sure, Vicky.
So the next one, so then we go on to somebody who may have the appearance of being a person with Down syndrome, walking with a carer, a person with mobility aid for using crutches. The middle character has a white disc on her arm, which is indicating a Libra patch for somebody with diabetes, which was one of the pieces. So when we first made the People Library, we asked all of BDP to suggest any additions to it, and people came forward with all sorts of different suggestions of, actually, I've never, I have diabetes, I use a Libra patch, and I've never seen myself depicted in a visual, and it would be really simple to do. So just things that, we put them in the visuals and maybe nobody notices, but maybe one person who's looking at our image who has diabetes notices and sees themselves for the first time. And that's, there's some power in that, I think. Then we have a lady with a blade who's taking a selfie, which I think quite often when you see somebody, an amputee with a blade, there's a stereotype of they're in the Paralympics, but actually just seeing somebody in a very day-to-day pose who is, taking a selfie is maybe quite an empowering way to depict somebody. And then different roles in terms of seeing women in PPE, because we realized that was lacking, and different characters in positions of power. So we have a police person, we have a doctor, and somebody that came up before who's maybe giving a presentation. So just trying to be more representative. And then different types of parenting. So a dad.
Sorry, it's jumping.
We'll go back one. I can talk about this one if not. These are different types of exercise. Again, the middle one could be somebody with an iPad, with their phone in their front pocket, but it could also depict somebody with a colostomy bag, an older couple exercising, somebody with a guide dog who's going for a jog, and not always showing people who are slim, but showing somebody who's a bit larger who is also exercising. So, and then different people with different ethnicities exercising as well. And then this is the one about relationships of parenting, a dad looking after more than one child, with one of them in a baby carry. I've forgotten the name of my mind's just gone blank. What, a sling? Yeah, that's what we call them anyway. And then potentially a gay couple, and a gay couple parenting, and then a mother with her child just reading a book, who's obviously got who's got more ethnic diversity, which could be many different types, with a hijab, and then a mother breastfeeding, which we drop her into quite a few visuals. Maybe people don't pick up on it, but I very rarely see somebody breastfeeding in an architectural visual, but I think it's really lovely to be able to depict that, because it's something that actually in the real world is what many mothers are trying to do in open spaces.
And not be ashamed of it, or feeling the need to have to tuck themselves into a corner. So we're just approaching the 1240 mark, which is great in terms of, you've given us an example of how they can be used, the People Library. But I'm going to hand it over to Nick, and Nick, maybe, from what you've been learning, what have you been working on as our BIM director?
So thanks, Lorene, and thanks, Vicky. I mean, Vicky, I have to admit, every time I hear this story, it amazes me, how simple, subtle changes can make such a huge impact in the stories that we tell and the messaging that goes behind the gift that we share in terms of creating the spaces. And I'm going to speak a little bit about the next steps on how this People Library can be used. And as Vicky mentioned, currently we have a vector collection of these characters, and looking at our current process, it is somewhat of a two-stream process on how we at BDP use this collection of people. And the first stream being in a sort of traditional sort of Photoshop workflow, whereby we will have a vector image and then perhaps a rendering that is developed from perhaps a Revit model or other 3D modeling design platforms. And then, in Photoshop, we may have a different team that is working, a team that is different from the actual design team that is, crafting the space. And then that gets pushed into a final rendering, which is, the sort of imagery that would be seen to the public or to clients. So that's the first stream in terms of the Photoshop work. The second stream would be the actual design team that's crafting the space, that's designing the space, building a 3D model, perhaps creating drawings from that 3D space. And there could be a disconnect between the people who are working and designing the space and thinking about the end user of that space. So, what we are attempting to do as the next steps is to streamline this process. And if you can flip to the next slide. So to have a more inclusive design process that is available to our designers. So the people library, the vectors, are actually readily available for the designers working within the design software to interact with, to actually have a deeper connection with the user group by having the ability to place these vector images or these, the people from the library directly into the 3D environment that is being designed. And this kind of collapses that two-stream process into a single stream process, whereby the designers are actively thinking of, and in some cases, engaging with these little characters that, as I mentioned before, these subtle things can make a huge impact in the way that people think about the space. And I think it goes the same hand in hand for our designers, because having a visual reminder or representation directly in our model or directly in our drawings, I think helps to change the way that we think about design. So this is where this inclusive process of having in this case, Revit is the software that we use, having a Revit version of this people library that could be used by the teams, the designers working in Revit, and having these people be placed directly into the 3D models, and giving that deeper connection to the designers, impacting the way they think about the space that they're designing and who they're designing for, being more at the forefront of the imagery that's actively being developed, and then that gets pushed to the final rendering. So this is the kind of enhanced process that we're working towards for our people at BDP. And if you can flip to the next slide. So this kind of shows some work in progress. So currently we have a bit of a trade secret or proprietary technique of converting the vector imagery into some native Revit families, for those of you who may know the term, but basically giving the design teams the ability to directly place these characters into a 3D model and have the accessibility of that library available at any point in time to basically include in imagery, whether it is work in progress imagery or imagery that can be developed into more sort of photorealistic representation at the end of it. So this is currently how we are actively utilizing the people library in practice. And I definitely think it makes a huge difference in the way that designers are thinking about the spaces, and having that deeper connection to the user groups directly in front of you is a subtle but powerful technique.
I love this, Nick. Like when you came on and we started talking about this, you started talking about all these things that, from my perspective, wasn't too sure how to manage, but the sort of the process and the BDP library and the guidance that Vicky and her team had set out really was an easy place for you to start in terms of beginning to now do all these, what I'm going to call very technical, maybe not my usual comfort zone. So I love that we're working through this. Vicky, I mean,
Absolutely.
yeah, like how have clients reacted to the
Yeah,
the
it's been
process and
really positive. If you got, yeah, so this is a visual that we did for a project in Manchester in the UK, which is a viaduct railway, disused railway, which is being turned into a landscaped walkway, I guess a little bit like the High Line in New York. And the people library people were used a lot in that imagery, and the client feedback for when we won the competition was that they could really see themselves and their communities represented in a way that other imagery had never shown them. And it felt like it was of them and for them as a client. So really the stylized look of the imagery with these different depictions of people in different roles really echoed with them about the communities that we would be designing for in a way that, yeah, felt very authentic to them. And we had some, like I say, some positive feedback that was part of the reason why they chose us for that bid, which was lovely. And then if you go on to the next example, but that's the same example again. So we use the people to talk through different scenarios and different ideas about how people might use the space going forward, which spoke really powerfully to them, which was lovely feedback to get. And then the next one, and then this was a project that Leeds had a year of culture last year, and one of the projects was for 300 women and non-binary people to raise a barn in 24 hours, which I did part of the night shift, which was in itself quite a thing. And we had a health and safety briefing the week before to tell us about how this was going to run. And it was done from the SketchUp model, which was a very basic model of the barn. And all of the characters that were in the imagery were all male, because they were the only ones available in PPE within the software. And so you had 300 women looking at a graphic of lots of men building something, and you're just thinking, this is not right. So we redid the visuals for them so that the next time they did the session, they could show women building the barn, which was, yeah, a lovely story of imaginary world trying to catch up with real world. Which is just ridiculous when you think about how one should definitely be easier than the other. And yeah, that's us all very tired, and I think that was at the end point of the frame going up. So yeah,
that's a great picture, Vicky. I mean, when you the first picture, like it's a closer depiction of this, the rendering is a closer picture of this actual photograph and the people who were there. So
yeah,
I love it. I love sort of what we've been talking about here, and we've thought about what's next for the BDP People Library. Nicholas, you've really moved it forward into sort of our day-to-day application. Still very much a work in progress, but sort of bridging that gap of the designer actually, putting in the people and giving pause to reflecting on, the end user, which is really important. I know on a personal note, a handful of times I received renderings back from 3D from third-party renderers. And, once I zoomed into a photo and there was a picture of like Biden and Obama having a coffee in the corner, and I really think they were just seeing if we would catch on this nuance. So I love that, here at BDP and at Human Space, we have the opportunity to produce something a lot more meaningful. So what's next? I mean, I think Vicky and her team have prepared this visual guidance and those 5 easy questions. Maybe maybe they're not so easy, but certainly a starting point for reflection. So, a key takeaway message is, working through that process, managing sort of the idea of being representative, but also avoiding tokenism. After this call, in a few weeks, the guidance document will be available to all participants of the call. Thinking about how to implement the strategies into your projects is something we encourage you all to do. And certainly stay in touch. I know before this webinar, I had received a handful of emails from people across North America, which was great. They already had some questions. So by all means, please do stay in touch. So, thank you, Vicky and Nicholas. I think we have about 10 minutes for some questions. I'm just going to move to the Q&A chat here and take a look what's come in. Oh, we have a question from Kate. Hi, Kate. I know we've run in many similar circles. I think one of your questions is around the representation of disability. I don't know if this came in time, but certainly, when Vicky worked through showing the range, the concept of inclusion certainly includes people with disabilities. And I think she's done a great job representing those different types of disabilities and a diverse sort of interactions with people. But I think, the concept of inclusion in this realm is certainly much larger than that. And she landed on the protected grounds and characteristics. Any questions currently from the crowd? I have another one here in the queue, but anyone currently have a question? Okay. I'm going to read this question here in the queue. Would you recommend representing the different demographics proportionately to the community? Or do you think it's important to show every possible demographic at least once in a set of images?
Shall I answer that one? Yeah, I think it depends on the project and on the client and on the audience for the visual. I think sometimes we have taken the stance whereby, you don't want to overpopulate an image. You do want to be able to, it's a composition and it's an artistic response, but we would, so in that respect, if you haven't got quite enough people that you want to show, you might overrepresent in order to include a wider range rather than hit a demographic where maybe only 2% or something is, if you haven't got 100 people in the image, you might not hit, you might overrepresent by trying to represent a broader range, which might skew the actual demographic data, if that makes sense.
Right. So I guess Vicky, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's this idea of it's not about necessarily doing a proportional, like you want to understand the demographics there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a scientific mathematical equation.
No, it's about what feels authentic to be able to depict as wide a range of the community,
right.
So that your image, when people are looking at the image of that community, they can see themselves in it.
Right. I think in prep for this, we looked at some images, and the idea of all the pregnant people with high heels was horrifying to see.
Yeah,
so the thoughtfulness.
Definitely.
I think the guidelines certainly give you a chance for thoughtfulness. There's a question here from Jody in Montreal about how do we elevate the brand of universal design to give it mainstream appeal? And I don't know.
Yeah, I think I guess that speaks to it's been easier to implement and use the People Library on what we call public sector clients in the UK. So local councils, community projects, schools, university projects, the high-rise, high-end residential market in London is harder to you know, sometimes people are trying to sell a particular image of architecture that is much less inclusive, in terms of they have particular style guidelines of how they want the architecture to be, which can then have a very negative, narrow way of representing the type of person that they think is going to buy that architectural product, which it can be, yeah, it's harder to be more authentic sometimes. But then I think that's where it's more important to try and be more
Right.
representative. So
Right. Yeah. And
yeah.
it's I think you've talked about it already, Vicky. Like if we're not thoughtful about it, you just may land on sort of what currently exists and you build upon it. But in fact, if you're thinking about the high rise condo market, we all know that it's an international market. So being aware of that's really important. Nick, were you going to say something about universal design?
No, I just think
Oh.
that's a very, very big question. And if we knew the answer to that, I think, we may solve many things, and, we may
Right.
have
I
different
wouldn't have
jobs.
a job. I wouldn't
Yeah,
have a
we may
job.
have different jobs, exactly.
But at the same time, I think this sort of thought process and this sort of reflection and thoughtfulness around the stories we tell as designers begins to sort of make it readily available, make it something that's, easily consumed and regularly consumed. And by default, over time, it does become part of the mainstream. And
Yeah.
then, it's
It's the changing of minds is not a overnight process. It definitely starts with, a single journey, one step, or single step long journey. I think it's within all of us to help push that, not agenda, but push the brand of universal design. I think we each have a responsibility as creatives to, be as inclusive as we can be.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think at the minute the People Library exists in a format that is quite user friendly for early renders because of the graphic style of the people. And I think placing people with a physical disability more prominently in the visuals from like before stage one, early design concepts, does help our designers to think about how the design is working at a point where it's still really flexible and things can change. And that's quite powerful in terms of, if in the foreground it's there's a river or a canal or a waterway, and you want to place somebody prominently in the foreground, and you realize actually it's really stepped and it's really inaccessible, then having that thought like that early on can maybe, change and sway the
Absolutely.
design process, which is really, really powerful. And it should be inherent in our thinking anyway, but it puts it front and center, which is helpful. I think I'd be really interested in everybody that's attending the webinar today, like after the webinar, giving feedback on whether they think it's, a worthwhile endeavor of creating the resource and where they think it needs to go next. We're certainly thinking about photorealistic people and trying to integrate 3D animated figures that walk through our software. Certainly in the UK version of Revit that we use, I'm aware that there's like one wheelchair user graphic person that you can play. So if you look at our renders or Foster's or Grimshaw, or any, like, if they ever do show a 3D graphic moving person in a wheelchair, it's the same one that is in, like, there's one in all of our animations, and that's woefully awful. So we're trying to speak to Autodesk to see if we can do a collaboration to use our People Library to influence maybe some inherent figures. But that's like a bigger task than we can take on by ourselves. So I guess a kind of call to action of like, is this something lots of people could get behind to try and for us to make that a more readily available collection of people that are, for different styles of visuals, I guess.
Yes, definitely. So, we're at 12:59. The time kind of came and gone really fast. So, maybe it's a good time to sort of wrap up and thank you, everyone. Thank you, Vicky and Nicholas, for committing to this and sharing your thoughts and sort of committing to communicating sort of our roles and responsibilities in the positions we all play. I'm looking at the participant list and recognize a lot of names on the calls. So I know each of you are in positions to be making change. So hopefully we've shared some thought-provoking some sort of thoughts for you to think about what you do in your projects. I think in terms of next steps, for anyone, there's a handful of questions in the Q&A, so we'll take a closer look at them and try to get back to you. Our wonderful team behind the scenes, they're actually hiding behind the human space icon and they're listening. They will be in touch to be sharing the resource guide document with you, and we would certainly love to hear your feedback to Vicky's questions around, what do you think's next? Is this worthwhile? Where do you see some additional opportunities to expand on? And if we do make some headway with Autodesk, we hope that you'll be there to support us and be part of the action. So I think with that, thank you, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful rest of day and take care.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.